Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. My first day at Ridgemont Correctional Facility was a Monday in early March 2024, and I remember the cold that seemed to seep through the concrete walls like something alive. Fresh out of the academy at 24, still carrying that naive confidence they hand you with your badge, I walked through those gates believing I understood what I was getting into. The hiring manager had been desperate enough to skip the usual 6-month waiting period, which should have told me something about the turnover rate. My girlfriend at the time, Naomi, had begged me to take the warehouse job her cousin offered instead, said prisons changed people in ways they never saw coming. I told her I wanted to make a difference, that someone had to do this work. She broke up with me 3 weeks later, said she could already see something hardening behind my eyes. I thought she was being dramatic. Now I understand she was probably the smartest person I ever dated. They assigned me to D Block, maximum security wing, where inmates served sentences so long that some had watched multiple wardens come and go. My supervisor was a thick-necked veteran named Sergeant Brennan Holloway, who walked like his knees had filed complaints decades ago. He gave me the tour with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list, pointing out which cells housed which categories of dangerous men: murderers in the East Row, violent offenders along the South Wall, and then we stopped at cell D47, the last one before the reinforced door leading to solitary. "That one," Holloway said, his voice dropping half an octave, "is Spencer Caldwell, model prisoner, 23 years in, never caused a single documented problem. Psych evals say he is basically reformed." He paused, studying my face like he was waiting for a question I did not know to ask. "Just remember, kid, the quiet ones have the most time to think." Spencer Caldwell did not look like the monsters I had imagined during training. He was somewhere in his late 50s, with silver hair cropped close to his scalp and reading glasses perpetually perched on the bridge of his nose. His cell was immaculate, books organized by color on a small shelf the warden had approved years ago, as a reward for good behavior. He read mostly philosophy and psychology texts, the kind with titles I had to look up later just to understand what they meant. The first time I did my rounds past his cell, he looked up from a worn copy of something by Marcus Aurelius and gave me a small nod. Nothing more. No predatory stare, no sizing me up like some of the others did. Just acknowledgement, one human being to another. I remember thinking Holloway had been paranoid, that 23 years really could change a man. That was the first of many times Spencer Caldwell made me feel like the smart one in the room. And I realize now that was entirely by design. The first month passed without incident, which in D Block was practically a miracle. I learned the rhythms of the place, the way tensions rose before mealtimes, how certain inmates could not be housed near others without triggering old beefs that predated my birth. Spencer helped me understand these dynamics in ways the official briefings never could. He would mention things casually during my rounds, observations wrapped in friendly concern. "Officer Tanner, you might want to keep an eye on Doyle in D12 today. He received a letter from his ex-wife yesterday, and he has that look." I would check, and sure enough, Doyle would be pacing his cell like a caged animal, muttering threats under his breath. I started adjusting my patrol patterns based on Spencer's suggestions, moving certain inmates to different recreation times, flagging potential conflicts before they erupted. My supervisors noticed the improvement in my section, started calling me a natural. I ate up the praise like a starving man, never once questioning how a prisoner confined to an 8x10 cell knew more about block dynamics than officers who walked it freely. By the 3rd month, I was stopping at Spencer's cell during quiet hours just to talk. He asked about my life outside the walls, and I found myself telling him things I had not shared with anyone, not even my own mother. The loneliness of the job, how my friends from high school had stopped inviting me to things because my schedule was unpredictable, and my stories made them uncomfortable. He listened with this focused attention that made you feel like the most important person in the world, nodding at the right moments, asking follow-up questions that showed he actually remembered details from previous conversations. He told me about his daughter, how she had been 7 when he was sentenced and now had children of her own, who did not know he existed. His voice cracked when he mentioned her name, Angela, and I saw what I thought was genuine remorse pooling in the corners of his eyes. Looking back, I cannot say whether any of it was real or just another performance refined over 2 decades of practice. The man had turned manipulation into an art form so complete that even now, knowing everything I know, part of me still wants to believe some of those moments were authentic. Spencer started asking for small favors around the 4th month, things so minor they barely registered as requests. Could I pass a message to an inmate in C Block, just telling him that Spencer hoped his appeal went well? Would I mind delivering a book to someone in the infirmary who was recovering from surgery? Each favor came wrapped in reasonable explanations and genuine gratitude, and they never violated any explicit rules I could point to. The messages were always innocuous when I read them, just well wishes and philosophical quotes. I became his courier without ever consciously deciding to take on the role, and the other inmates started treating me differently because of it. Doors opened easier, tensions diffused faster, and I mistook fear for respect. There was one inmate, a massive man named Jerome Battles, who had put 3 guards in the hospital before my time, and he actually stepped aside in the corridor when he saw me coming. I thought I had earned something through my fair treatment of the population. The truth was far simpler and far more disturbing. I had become Spencer Caldwell's property, and everyone knew it except me. The first death happened on a Friday in late June, and I remember the heat that day was suffocating, the kind that makes men irritable and guards careless. An inmate named Terrence Blackwood was found in the shower block, with his throat opened by a sharpened toothbrush handle. Blackwood had been a problem for years, a rapist who targeted younger inmates and had connections to guards who looked the other way for the right price. The investigation lasted 2 weeks, and concluded that another inmate, a skinny kid named Darren Foley who Blackwood had been threatening, had acted in self-defense. Foley confessed readily, almost eagerly accepting the additional years on his sentence with a calm that struck me as strange. I mentioned the whole situation to Spencer during one of our conversations, how something about Foley's demeanor bothered me. Spencer just shrugged and said, "Sometimes men find peace when they finally stand up for themselves." He asked me to deliver a book to Foley in solitary, a collection of poems by someone named Rumi. I did it without thinking, just another small favor for a friend. Never occurred to me to wonder how Spencer knew Foley needed comfort, or why Foley smiled when he saw the book like he had been expecting it. The second death came in August, a guard this time, which shook the entire facility in ways inmate deaths never did. Officer Lawrence Kemp had worked D Block for 11 years and was known for being cruel in ways that never quite crossed the line into actionable misconduct. He would accidentally spill food trays, lose mail from loved ones, schedule strip searches at humiliating times. The inmates hated him with a patience that prison teaches, and Kemp seemed to feed on their impotent rage. He was found in the parking lot after his shift, beaten so badly that dental records were needed for identification. 3 inmates had escaped during a transport earlier that day, and the official conclusion was that Kemp had been targeted as revenge for years of mistreatment. The escapees were caught a week later in New Mexico and denied involvement, but nobody believed them. I attended Kemp's memorial service and felt guilty for not feeling sadder, which I mentioned to Spencer the following week. He told me that guilt was just our conscience reminding us to be better than the people we dislike. I thought it was profound. I wrote it down in a journal I kept at the time, a journal that would later become evidence. Everything unraveled on a Wednesday in early September. The kind of crisp autumn morning that makes you forget you work in a place designed to contain human misery. I was doing my regular rounds when I noticed something unusual in D31, the cell belonging to a lifer named Carlton Hayes. Hayes was slumped against the wall with foam crusted around his mouth and his eyes fixed on nothing, and even before I called it in, I knew he was dead. The medics determined it was poisoning. Something slipped into his evening meal, and suddenly the facility was swarming with state investigators who did not work for the warden and could not be influenced by internal politics. Hayes, it turned out, had been cooperating with federal authorities on a corruption case involving drug trafficking through the prison. He had names, dates, and documentation hidden somewhere outside the walls, and he was scheduled to testify in 2 weeks. The investigators started pulling records, interviewing inmates and tracing every interaction Hayes had in his final days. They found the poison had been passed through 4 different hands before reaching his food tray, a chain of inmates who had never spoken to each other directly, but had all received messages and favors through various intermediaries. When they mapped the network on a whiteboard in the warden's conference room, every line eventually traced back to a single point of origin: Cell D47. I was called into interrogation on the second day, and the woman across the table from me had eyes that seemed to read the lies you were planning before you even spoke them. Her name was Special Agent Corinne Walsh, and she laid out photographs on the metal surface between us like a dealer spreading cards. Terrence Blackwood in the shower, throat gaping. Lawrence Kemp in the parking lot, face unrecognizable. Carlton Hayes slumped in his cell, lips blue. 3 more I did not recognize, incidents from before my time that had been ruled accidents or suicides. She asked me about the messages I had delivered, the books I had passed along, the small favors that seemed so harmless at the time. I answered everything, holding nothing back, and with each answer I watched her expression shift from suspicion to something worse: pity. She showed me transcripts of recorded conversations between inmates, discussions of debts owed and orders received, and my name appeared 17 times as the unwitting courier. Spencer had been running D-Block like a puppet master for over a decade, using guards and inmates alike as extensions of his will, eliminating threats and consolidating power without ever raising his voice or leaving his cell. I had been his favorite tool for nearly 6 months, and I had thanked him for the privilege. They let me see him one last time before the transfer, though I still do not understand why I asked. Maybe I needed to look into his eyes and search for some sign that our conversations had meant something, that not every moment had been calculation. Spencer was sitting on his bunk when I approached the bars, reading glasses folded neatly on his knee, and he looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger or defeat or even disappointment. It was amusement, the quiet satisfaction of a chess player reviewing a game he had already won regardless of the final move. "You are good, Tanner," he said, his voice carrying that same warmth that had made me trust him in the first place. "Better than most. You actually believed you were helping people." I asked him why, demanded to know what the point of all the death had been, and he just tilted his head like I had asked something genuinely puzzling. "Control," he said simply. "In here, that is all there is. The men who hurt others without consequence, the guards who abuse their power, the system that pretends justice exists behind these walls. I balanced the scales in my own way." He smiled then, and for the first time I saw something behind his eyes that the psychological evaluations had somehow missed for 23 years. A coldness so complete it made the concrete walls feel warm by comparison. "You should thank me, actually. Your section had the lowest incident rate in the facility. I kept your people safe. I resigned 3 days later and never set foot in a correctional facility again. The official investigation took 8 months and resulted in 14 indictments, including 3 guards who had been consciously working with Spencer for years, accepting payments funneled through family members on the outside. Spencer himself was transferred to a federal supermax in Colorado, the kind of place where inmates spend 23 hours a day in solitary, and communication with anyone is monitored down to the last syllable. Agent Walsh told me he would die there, that the system he had built at Ridgemont could not be replicated under that level of scrutiny. I want to believe her, but some nights I lie awake thinking about all the things he taught me about patience and long-term thinking, about how a man with nothing but time can accomplish things that seem impossible. I work construction now, outdoors mostly. where I can see the sky and nobody depends on me for anything more complicated than carrying lumber. My therapist says I am making progress, that the guilt I carry is not proportional to my actual culpability, that I was manipulated by someone who had refined his techniques over decades. She is probably right. But I still remember the way Jerome Battles stepped aside when he saw me coming, the fear in his eyes that I mistook for respect, and I understand now that fear was not for me. It was for the man whose errands I was running, the man who could end lives with a whispered suggestion, the man who made me believe I was finally good at something when all I ever was, from the very first day, was useful. Coffee had gone cold in the styrofoam cup beside me when I first noticed the pattern in his breathing. April 2017. I remember because my daughter had just turned 7 the week before, and I was still carrying one of her birthday stickers on my laptop case, a glittery unicorn she had pressed there with her small fingers. Criminal psychology journalism had been my life for nearly a decade by then, having graduated from Northwestern in 2005 and spent years building a reputation for behavioral analysis pieces that went deeper than the usual crime reporting. That morning I was sitting across from a man named Simon Drucker in a small conference room at the Crestwood County Sheriff's Department in rural Ohio. He had agreed to speak with me about his former roommate, a man currently awaiting trial for the murders of 3 women in the Toledo area. Simon was technically just a witness, a peripheral figure in the investigation. But 15 minutes into our conversation, I realized I was looking at something far more interesting and far more dangerous than the man sitting in a cell downtown. Simon had this way of tilting his head exactly 2 seconds after I finished speaking, as if he was processing my words through some internal calculator before responding. His eyes would track to my mouth, then my hands, then back to my eyes in a precise triangular pattern that never varied. When I mentioned the victims, Bethany, April, and Suzanne, he produced the appropriate facial expressions, the furrowed brow, the slight downturn of the lips, the slow shake of his head. But the timing was wrong. Each reaction arrived a fraction of a second too late, like a foreign film with poorly synced dubbing. I had interviewed hundreds of people connected to violent crimes, from grieving families to reluctant witnesses to the perpetrators themselves. I knew what genuine emotion looked like, and I knew what performance looked like. Simon Drucker was giving me a masterclass in the latter, and he had no idea that I could see right through him. Or maybe, and this thought would haunt me for months, maybe he knew exactly what I could see, and he was showing me anyway. The interview lasted 2 hours. I asked him about his childhood in Dayton, his years working as an insurance adjuster, his relationship with the accused. Simon answered every question with the same measured cadence, never rushing, never stumbling. He told me about discovering that his roommate had been keeping newspaper clippings about the murders in a shoebox under his bed. He described calling the police, the shock he claimed to feel, the sleepless nights that followed. But here is what caught my attention. When he recounted finding those clippings, his pupils did not dilate. His breathing remained steady at 14 breaths per minute, the same rate he had maintained since sitting down. I had studied micro-expressions under Paul Ekman's methodology for years. I knew that genuine surprise triggers involuntary physiological responses. Simon's body betrayed nothing because there was nothing to betray. He had known about those clippings long before he claimed to have discovered them. Maybe he had put them there himself. After the interview, I sat in my rental car in the parking lot for almost an hour, reviewing my notes and the audio recording. Simon had said something near the end that kept circling back to me. When I asked him how he felt about potentially testifying against his former roommate, he had paused, the first genuine pause of the entire conversation, and said, "I think about consequences a lot, Miss Callahan. Every action has a reaction. Every choice creates a ripple." He had smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that did not reach his eyes, did not crinkle the skin at his temples. did not engage the orbicularis oculi muscle at all. It was a smile constructed entirely by the zygomaticus major, the muscle responsible for pulling the corners of the mouth upward. In other words, it was a fake smile worn by someone who had learned to imitate human warmth without ever feeling it. I drove back to my hotel that night with his words echoing in my head, not realizing that I had just become one of his ripples. I published the article 6 weeks later in the Atlantic Monthly under the title, "The Witness Who Knew Too Much." It was not an accusation. I was careful about that. I never named Simon directly, referring to him only as a secondary witness whose behavioral patterns raised significant concerns. I detailed the micro-expression inconsistencies, the rehearsed quality of his emotional responses, the textbook markers of what psychologists call affective poverty. The piece gained traction quickly, shared across true crime forums and psychology departments alike. My editor called it the best work I had ever done. Colleagues reached out to congratulate me. For a few weeks, I felt that particular satisfaction that comes from exposing something hidden, from shining a light into a dark corner that others had overlooked. I did not think about Simon Drucker. I assumed he would never read the article, never connect the anonymized subject to himself. That assumption was the first of many mistakes. The first letter arrived on a Wednesday in late June, exactly 3 days after the article went live online. It came to my home address, not my office at the magazine, not the P.O. box I used for professional correspondence, but my actual house in suburban Chicago where I lived with my husband Tom and our daughter Lily. The envelope was plain white, no return address, postmarked from Columbus, Ohio. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. 14 breaths per minute. You were counting. I was counting too. You noticed my patterns, Miss Callahan. I wonder if you have noticed your own. For instance, you touch your left earring when you are nervous. You did it 7 times during our conversation. You also blink more rapidly when you believe you have discovered something important. Your blink rate increased by 40% when I mentioned the newspaper clippings. We are not so different, you and I. We both watch. We both wait. We both see what others miss. There was no signature. There did not need to be. I called the police that same afternoon. A detective named Ruben Salazar came to my house, took the letter as evidence, and assured me they would look into it. He was kind but skeptical in the way that cops often are when the threat is not immediate, when there is no broken window or visible bruise to photograph. He asked if I had any enemies, any disgruntled sources, any ex-boyfriends who might hold a grudge. I explained about Simon, about the interview, about the article. Detective Salazar nodded and wrote things down in his notepad, but I could see in his posture that he considered this a low priority. An anonymous letter from a potentially unstable individual, unpleasant, but not actionable. He told me to keep the doors locked, to vary my routine, to call immediately if anything else happened. Standard advice, reasonable advice. The kind of advice that means absolutely nothing when someone has already demonstrated they know where you live, where you work, and how many times you blink when you are afraid. Tom wanted to install a security system that night. I told him we should wait, see if this was an isolated incident. I wanted to believe it was an isolated incident. The second letter came 4 days later. Same plain envelope, same typed format, but this time postmarked from Indianapolis. You told Detective Salazar that I was potentially unstable. I heard you through the window. Your kitchen needs better curtains, Miss Callahan. The gap on the left side is almost 3 inches wide. I stood in your backyard at 7:43 in the evening while you made dinner. Spaghetti with meat sauce, Lily's favorite. She sat at the table doing homework while you stirred the pot and talked on the phone with your mother. You mentioned me. You called me creepy. I suppose that is fair. But creepy is such a reductive word, do you not think? It flattens complexity into caricature. You of all people should understand that human behavior exists on a spectrum. I am simply further along that spectrum than most. Further along than you, certainly, but not by as much as you would like to believe. I read that letter standing in my kitchen, in the exact spot where I had stood 4 days earlier making spaghetti. The gap in the curtains was exactly where he said it was. I measured it with a ruler, 2 7/8 inches. Tom installed the security system the next morning. Cameras on every corner of the house, motion sensors in the yard, a panic button hardwired to the local police station. We replaced every curtain with blackout fabric, the kind that lets no light in and no light out. I took a leave of absence from the magazine, telling my editor I needed time to work on a longer project. In truth, I could not concentrate on anything except Simon Drucker. I spent hours researching him online, digging through public records, social media traces, anything I could find. He had no Facebook profile, no LinkedIn, no digital footprint whatsoever beyond a single photograph in a 2011 newsletter from the insurance company where he used to work. In that photo, he stood at the edge of a group, half turned away from the camera, his face partially obscured. Even then, even in a mundane corporate context, he had positioned himself to be seen without being fully visible. I printed that photograph and pinned it to the wall of my home office. I stared at it for hours, trying to understand the architecture of his mind, trying to predict his next move. I was doing exactly what he wanted me to do. I know that now. He wanted to live inside my head, and I had opened the door and invited him in. The third letter arrived on Lily's birthday, July 15th. It was tucked inside a pink envelope decorated with cartoon balloons, mixed in with the birthday cards from her grandparents and school friends. I almost let her open it. My hand was already reaching to pass it to her when I noticed there was no return address, no stamp. It had been hand-delivered directly into our mailbox sometime during the night. Inside was a birthday card with a picture of a kitten wearing a party hat. The printed message said, "Hope your special day is perfect." Below it, in the same typed font as the letters, Simon had added his own note. 7 years old today. She has your eyes, Miss Callahan. That specific shade of green with the amber flecks near the pupil. I noticed it when she was playing in the front yard last Thursday. She was wearing a yellow dress with white daisies. Her laugh sounds like wind chimes. You should be proud. You have created something beautiful. I have never created anything beautiful, only the opposite. I wonder sometimes what that feels like to make something instead of unmake it. Perhaps you could explain it to me. Perhaps we could discuss it in person. Soon. I did not scream. I did not cry. I walked calmly to the bathroom, closed the door, and vomited until there was nothing left inside me. We left Chicago that same afternoon. Tom called his brother in Milwaukee and arranged for us to stay at his cabin near Lake Geneva, a small place surrounded by woods with no neighbors for half a mile in any direction. I packed 3 suitcases in under 20 minutes. Clothes, toiletries, Lily's favorite stuffed rabbit, my laptop, and the folder containing all of Simon's letters. Detective Salazar told me I was overreacting, that there was still no evidence of an imminent threat, that running away would only delay the inevitable confrontation. I hung up on him mid-sentence. The drive took 90 minutes, and I spent the entire time watching the rearview mirror, scanning every car that appeared behind us, memorizing license plates and driver silhouettes. Tom kept one hand on my knee and the other on the wheel, his jaw tight, his knuckles pale. Lily sat in the back seat watching cartoons on her tablet, oblivious to the fact that her entire world had just been uprooted because a man she had never met had decided to make her mother the focus of his attention. I had studied predators for years. I had written about their methods, their motivations, their patterns of escalation. I knew that flight was rarely a permanent solution, that determined stalkers could track their targets across state lines, across countries, across decades. But I also knew that staying in that house, in that kitchen with the curtains I could no longer look at without feeling sick, was no longer an option. The cabin should have felt safe. It was isolated, hidden, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through dense pine forest. Tom's brother had not used it in years, and we told no one where we were going. Not my editor, not my mother, not even Detective Salazar. For 3 days, We existed in a kind of suspended animation, playing board games with Lily, cooking simple meals, pretending that we were on a spontaneous family vacation, rather than hiding from a man who had memorized the color of my daughter's eyes. On the fourth morning, I woke at sunrise and walked down to the lake to clear my head. The water was still, reflecting the pale orange sky like a mirror. I stood on the wooden dock and breathed deeply, trying to convince myself that we had escaped, that Simon could not possibly know where we were, that the nightmare was finally over. Then I looked down and saw it, a single sheet of white paper tucked beneath a rock at the edge of the dock. The typed message was brief. "The lake is beautiful at dawn. 14 breaths per minute, Miss Callahan. You are calmer here. That is good. Calm people make better decisions. I will be in touch." I did not move for a long time. I just stood there watching the water, understanding for the first time that there was nowhere on earth I could go where he would not find me. I stopped running after that morning, not because I gave up, but because I finally understood that running was part of his game. He wanted me afraid, reactive, predictable. So I did the opposite. I called Detective Salazar and apologized for hanging up on him. I contacted an FBI agent named Claudia Vega, who specialized in stalking cases, and provided her with every letter, every detail, every observation I had made about Simon's behavioral patterns. I hired a private investigator named Marshall Kent, a former Army intelligence officer who understood surveillance and counter-surveillance in ways that most civilians never would. For 3 months, we built a case. Marshall discovered that Simon had been following me for weeks before our initial interview. He had requested the meeting, not the sheriff's department. He had manufactured the connection to the accused killer, inserting himself into the investigation specifically to get access to me. He had read every article I had ever written, attended 2 conferences where I had spoken, and created a detailed psychological profile of my habits and vulnerabilities. When the FBI finally arrested him in October, they found a storage unit in Cincinnati containing over 400 photographs of me, my family, my home, my car. They found notebooks filled with transcriptions of conversations he had overheard. They found detailed maps of every location I had visited in the past 2 years. He had been studying me the way I studied criminals, methodically, patiently, obsessively. The difference was that I wrote articles. He was planning something else entirely, something the investigators never fully disclosed to me, but that I understood from the look in Agent Vega's eyes when she told me we had stopped him just in time. Simon Drucker is currently serving 12 years in a federal facility in Pennsylvania for stalking, criminal harassment, and making terroristic threats. He will be eligible for parole in 2026. I know this because I check the status of his case every single month, marking the days on a calendar that I keep hidden in my desk drawer. Tom and I sold the house in Chicago and moved to a different state. I will not say which one. Lily is 14 now, a freshman in high school who plays volleyball and wants to become a veterinarian. She does not remember much about that summer, and I have never told her the full story. I still work as a journalist, though I no longer write about criminal psychology. I cover education policy now, school funding and curriculum debates, subjects that feel safely distant from the darkness I once found so fascinating. Sometimes late at night I catch myself counting my own breaths, 14 per minute when I am calm, 18 when I am anxious, 22 when I remember the way Simon tilted his head and smiled at me across that conference room table. I spent years learning to read the minds of predators, believing that knowledge would protect me. What I learned instead is that understanding a monster does not make you immune to becoming its prey. It just means you see the teeth more clearly before they close around you. Everyone kept telling me I deserved someone who would treat me right, and when Nathan walked into my life, I thought the universe had finally listened. I was 26, working as a paralegal at a mid-sized firm in Austin, and still recovering from a relationship that left me unable to trust my own judgment. We met at a coffee shop near my apartment on a Saturday morning in August of 2017. He was sitting alone with a philosophy book, and when I accidentally bumped his table reaching for napkins, he looked up with this warm, patient smile and apologized, even though it was completely my fault. He offered to buy me a replacement coffee even though I had not spilled mine, asked my name like he genuinely wanted to remember it, and that first conversation stretched into 3 hours without either of us noticing. Nathan asked about my childhood, my dreams, the things that kept me up at night. When I mentioned losing my father 2 years earlier, his expression shifted into something so tender that I almost cried right there in that coffee shop. He reached across the table and held my hand, said nothing for a moment, just let me feel understood. I drove home that afternoon thinking I had finally met the person I was supposed to be with. Nathan told me he worked in consulting, which explained why he traveled so often, sometimes gone for a week at a time. He always called around 11 at night when he was away, and hearing his voice became the thing I looked forward to most. Those first months were unlike anything I had experienced before. He remembered tiny details I mentioned in passing, surprised me with my favorite flowers on random weekdays, and never once made me feel stupid for being emotional or needy. When I cried about work stress or grief over my dad, he held me and said exactly what I needed to hear. My friends adored him. My mother kept hinting about grandchildren. I started picturing our wedding, our future kids, the house we would buy in the suburbs. He introduced me to his family over video call, a distant mother in Florida and a quiet brother named Colby who barely spoke. Nathan said his family had always been complicated, that they were not close, and I understood because mine had its own fractures too. 6 months in, he handed me a key to his apartment and told me he had never felt this way about anyone in his entire life. I remember holding that key and feeling like everything broken inside me was finally starting to heal. The first crack appeared around month 8, so small I almost missed it. We were at dinner with my coworker Beth and her husband, and I made a joke about Nathan being terrible at cooking. Everyone laughed, including him, but on the drive home he went completely silent. When I asked what was wrong, he said nothing at first, just kept his eyes on the road. Then, in this calm and measured voice, he told me that I had embarrassed him in front of people, that I had made him look incompetent, that a partner should build you up instead of tearing you down in public. I was so caught off guard that I apologized immediately, even though part of me knew the joke had been harmless. He accepted my apology, squeezed my hand, and by the time we got home, he was back to his normal self, making tea and asking about my day like nothing had happened. I told myself I had been insensitive, that I needed to be more careful with his feelings. But something about the way he had delivered those words stuck with me. There was no anger in his voice, no raised tone. Just this flat, rehearsed quality, like he had given that speech before and knew exactly how it would land. After that night, I started noticing patterns I had been blind to. Nathan was incredibly attentive when I was happy, when things were going well, when I was grateful and affectionate toward him. But whenever I was upset about something unrelated to us, whenever I needed support that did not involve praising him or making him feel needed, he became distant and impatient. I remember calling him once after a terrible day at work, crying because a case I had spent months on fell apart, and his response was to ask if I had picked up his dry cleaning like I promised. When I said I forgot because of everything happening, he sighed and told me he understood, but his voice had this edge to it, this quiet disappointment that made me feel guilty for being upset in the first place. I started keeping my problems to myself. I stopped calling him when I was sad. I learned to perform happiness around him because that was the only version of me he seemed to want. My friends noticed I was quieter, that I laughed less, but when they asked if everything was okay, I said yes because I did not know how to explain what was happening. I did not even have words for it yet. The lies started unraveling on a Wednesday in March, almost a year into the relationship. Nathan had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he showered, and I walked past it on my way to grab water. I was not snooping, not at first, but the screen was right there, and there was a Facebook message notification from someone named Kristen with a heart emoji next to her name. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, telling myself not to look, telling myself there had to be an explanation. Then I clicked. The conversation went back months. She called him baby, asked when he was coming to visit again, mentioned missing him in her bed. There were photos I wish I had never seen. My whole body went numb as I scrolled, reading message after message that proved the man I loved had been living a double life. When Nathan came out of the shower and saw me standing there, he did not panic. He did not yell or try to grab the laptop. He just looked at me with this expression of profound sadness, like I was the one who had done something wrong by finding out. He sat me down and explained that Kristen was an ex who could not let go, that she was mentally unstable, that he had been trying to end things gently without pushing her over the edge. He cried. He held my face in his hands and swore on his dead grandmother that I was the only one he loved. I wanted to believe him so badly that I almost did. But something made me dig deeper over the following weeks, checking his phone when he slept, looking through old emails he thought he had deleted. What I found was worse than Kristen. There was another woman named Paige in Dallas who thought she was his girlfriend, a third named Monica in Houston, who had been sending him money for a business investment that did not exist. His consulting job turned out to be real, but he had been fired 8 months earlier, which meant every business trip had been a lie. Every late-night call from a hotel room had been made from someone else's apartment. I found a court record from 2014 showing he had been sued by a former partner for fraud. I found a different last name attached to a LinkedIn profile with his photo. The man I had given a key to my apartment, the man I had cried in front of and trusted with my deepest fears, was a complete fabrication. When I confronted him with everything, printed out and spread across the table, he did not deny it. He just looked at me with those same soft eyes and said, I was the only one who ever really knew him, that he had made mistakes but was ready to change, that leaving him now would destroy the only good thing in his life. He made me feel like walking away would be an act of cruelty. I stayed for another 3 months, which I know sounds insane to anyone reading this, but you have to understand how it works when someone like Nathan gets inside your head. Every time I tried to bring up the lies, he turned it around on me. He said I was paranoid, that I was letting my past trauma ruin something beautiful, that my inability to forgive was proof I had never really loved him. He cried so often during those conversations that I ended up comforting him instead of getting answers. He started monitoring where I went, who I talked to, how long I took to respond to his texts. If I was 10 minutes late coming home from work, he needed a detailed explanation. If I mentioned a male coworker, he wanted to know everything about him. He framed it all as concern, as love, as fear of losing me after everything we had been through. My friend Beth tried to have a conversation with me about it once, said she was worried I was not acting like myself anymore, and I got so defensive that we did not speak for 2 weeks. Nathan told me she was jealous of what we had, that real friends would support our relationship instead of trying to tear it apart. I believed him because believing him was easier than admitting I had wasted a year of my life on someone who did not exist. The isolation happened so gradually that I did not notice until it was complete. My mom and I used to talk every Sunday, but Nathan always seemed to need me during those calls, always had some small emergency that required my attention. I stopped reaching out to friends because explaining why I could not meet up was exhausting, and Nathan's disappointment when I made plans without him was unbearable. He never told me I could not see people. He just made it so uncomfortable that avoiding everyone felt like the path of least resistance. I lost weight because I was too anxious to eat. I stopped sleeping through the night because I never knew which version of him I would wake up next to. Some mornings he was the Nathan I fell in love with, affectionate and attentive, making me breakfast and telling me how lucky he was. Other mornings he was cold and distant, answering my questions with one word, making me feel like I had done something wrong without ever telling me what. I spent hours analyzing my own behavior, trying to figure out what triggered the switch, convinced that if I could just be better, calmer, more understanding, he would go back to being the man I met in that coffee shop. That was the trap. I kept chasing someone who had never been real in the first place. The day everything broke was a Sunday in June, almost 18 months after we first met. I had gone to brunch with Beth, the first time I had seen her in months, and I made the mistake of not telling Nathan beforehand. When I came home, he was sitting in the dark living room just waiting. He did not yell. That was the thing about Nathan, he almost never raised his voice. He just asked me where I had been, who I was with, why I had lied to him. I told him I had not lied, that I just forgot to mention it, and he laughed in this quiet, hollow way that made my stomach turn. He said he knew I was seeing someone else, that Beth was probably covering for me, that he had given me everything, and this was how I repaid him. I tried to argue, tried to show him the receipt from the restaurant, but he was not interested in proof. He grabbed my phone out of my hand and started going through my messages, my photos, my emails. When I reached for it back, he shoved me into the wall. Not hard enough to leave a mark, just hard enough to make me understand that he could. He looked at me afterward with this wounded expression, like I had forced him to do it, like my behavior had given him no choice. That was the moment I finally understood what I was dealing with. I was not in a relationship, I was in a cage, and the door had been locked for longer than I realized. I started planning my exit in secret, which felt insane because I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Normal people do not have to plan escapes from their boyfriends. Normal people do not hide cash in tampon boxes or memorize the location of the nearest police station. But some instinct I did not fully trust was screaming at me to be careful, to not let him know I was leaving until I was already gone. I reached out to Beth and told her everything, every lie, every manipulation, the shove against the wall. She did not judge me. She just asked what I needed and started helping me make a plan. I was going to wait until Nathan left for one of his trips, pack what I could fit in my car, and drive to my mom's place 4 hours away. I changed my bank passwords, started forwarding important mail to Beth's address, even looked up how to get a restraining order in Texas. For 2 weeks, I played the perfect girlfriend, agreeable and affectionate, never giving him a reason to suspect. It was the hardest performance of my life, kissing him goodnight while knowing he had shoved me into a wall and felt nothing. But I kept reminding myself that it was almost over, that I just had to hold on a little longer. Nathan left on a Tuesday morning for what he said was a 4-day trip to Phoenix. I watched him pack his suitcase, kissed him goodbye at the door, told him I loved him. The second his car turned the corner, I started moving. I had boxes hidden in the closet behind winter clothes, and I filled them as fast as I could, taking only what mattered. Photos of my dad, important documents, enough clothes to last a few weeks. I left behind jewelry he had given me, furniture we had picked out together, anything that might make him think I was coming back. Beth met me at the apartment and helped me load everything into my car. The whole process took less than 2 hours, but it felt like days. I kept expecting to hear his key in the lock, kept imagining what he would do if he walked in and found me halfway out the door. When I finally drove away from that apartment complex, I cried so hard I had to pull over twice. Not because I missed him, but because I realized how close I had come to disappearing completely. The person I was before Nathan felt like a stranger, someone I had abandoned without even noticing. I left my key on the kitchen counter next to a note that said only 2 words. I am done. No explanation, no apology, nothing he could use against me later. The drive to my mom's house was the longest 4 hours of my life, and for weeks afterward I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Nathan called 47 times in the first 3 days. He left voicemails that cycled through every emotion, begging and crying, and then cold and threatening, and then sweet again, promising he would change if I just gave him one more chance. I blocked his number, and he created new ones. I blocked those too. He emailed my work account, messaged my friends on social media, even sent flowers to my mom's house with a card that said he would always love me. My mom called the police, but they said there was nothing they could do unless he showed up in person or made explicit threats. For months I jumped every time I heard a car door slam, checked every parking lot for his black Camry, avoided going anywhere alone after dark. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The calls, the messages, the flowers, everything went quiet. I never heard from Nathan again. I do not know if he found a new target, got arrested for something else, or simply decided I was not worth the effort. Sometimes I search his name online just to see if anything comes up, and I always find nothing. It is like he never existed at all, which I guess is fitting because the man I fell in love with never did. I'm 30 now, still living near my mom, still flinching at loud noises in quiet rooms. I date sometimes, but I cannot stop looking for the signs, the too perfect attention, the questions that dig a little too deep, the empathy that only shows up when it benefits them. I do not know if I will ever trust anyone the way I trusted him, and maybe that is okay. Maybe surviving someone like Nathan means carrying a piece of that fear forever, like a scar that never fully fades. I just hope whoever reads this recognizes something before it is too late. The warning signs are always there. We just have to stop telling ourselves we are imagining them. Neighbors never checked on me, and I preferred it that way. My house sat at the end of Birchwood Lane in a quiet suburb outside of Cleveland, Ohio, where most folks kept their lawns trimmed and their conversations short. I had graduated from Lakewood High back in 2007, which meant I had spent nearly 2 decades watching people around me build families, careers, connections I never quite understood how to form. My mother passed when I was 11, my father drank himself into an early grave 6 years later, and my older brother Keith overdosed in the bathroom of a gas station somewhere in Michigan before I turned 25. So by the time that particular Wednesday morning in October 2024 arrived, I had been living alone in my childhood home for almost a decade, working remotely as a data entry clerk, ordering groceries online, and speaking to other human beings maybe once or twice a month. The silence of that house had become my entire world, and I had convinced myself that was exactly what I needed. That morning started like any other, with me waking up around 6 to the sound of the furnace kicking on and the familiar creak of the old pipes running through the walls. I made coffee in the same chipped mug I had used since college, scrolled through work emails on my laptop at the kitchen table, and listened to the wind rattle the loose screen on the back porch. The sky outside was that flat gray color Ohio gets in late autumn, the kind that makes everything feel muted and heavy. I remember thinking the house felt colder than usual, even with the heat running. There was a draft coming from somewhere I could not identify, and when I walked through the living room, I noticed the basement door was slightly ajar. I always kept that door closed. My father used to say the basement held bad memories, and even after all those years, I never liked going down there. I pushed the door shut, heard the latch click, and told myself the old frame must have warped again with the temperature change. It was a simple explanation, the kind of thing that happens in old houses all the time. Around 9, I went back downstairs to refill my coffee and found the basement door open again. Not just ajar this time, but wide open, the darkness beyond it spilling into the hallway like something alive. I stood there staring at it for a long moment, my mug halfway to my lips, trying to process what I was seeing. The latch was old, but it worked fine. I had heard it click into place just a few hours earlier. There was no wind inside the house strong enough to push a door open, no logical reason for it to have moved on its own. I set my coffee down on the counter and walked toward the doorway, close enough to feel the cold air rising from below. The basement smelled the way it always did, like damp concrete and old cardboard boxes and something faintly chemical that I had never been able to identify. I reached for the light switch on the wall, flipped it, and watched the single bare bulb at the bottom of the stairs flicker to life. Nothing moved down there. Nothing made a sound. But I could not shake the feeling that something had just been standing at the bottom of those steps, waiting in the dark. I did not go down to check. Instead, I closed the door again, locked the deadbolt this time, and went back to work at my kitchen table. My hands were steady, but my mind was not. I kept glancing toward the hallway, kept listening for the sound of that latch clicking open. kept imagining footsteps on the concrete floor beneath me. The thing about living alone for so long is that you develop a relationship with silence. You learn its textures, its rhythms, the difference between the quiet of an empty house and the quiet of a house that is holding its breath. That morning, the silence had changed. It had weight to it, a thickness that pressed against my eardrums and made the normal sounds of the house seem muffled and far away. I tried to focus on my spreadsheets, on the endless columns of numbers that paid my bills and filled my hours, but I kept making mistakes, transposing digits, skipping rows, losing my place in the data. By noon, I had accomplished almost nothing, and my neck was stiff from tension I had not realized I was carrying. I decided to make lunch just to give myself something normal to do. I was standing at the stove heating up a can of soup when I heard a voice from the living room. It was faint, barely above a whisper, but I heard it clearly enough to make out the words. Someone said my name. Not my full name, but the nickname my mother used to call me when I was a child, the one nobody else in the world had ever used. Tommy Bird. She called me that because I used to wake up early and sit by the window watching the sparrows in the backyard, and she said I chirped just like them when I got excited about something. I had not heard that name spoken out loud in over 20 years. I turned off the burner and stood completely still, the can of soup forgotten, listening so hard my ears started to ring. The house was silent again. No footsteps, no breathing, no rustle of movement. Just that heavy, waiting quiet that had settled over everything since morning. I told myself I had imagined it. I told myself the isolation was getting to me, that I needed to go outside, talk to another human being, do something to break the pattern of my days. But deep down, in the part of my brain that still remembered what my mother's voice sounded like, I knew what I had heard. I found him in my mother's old bedroom. I had kept that room closed since she died, the door locked, everything inside exactly as she left it. Her reading glasses on the nightstand, her slippers by the bed. The framed photograph of Keith and me as children, taken at Cedar Point the summer before everything started to fall apart. I never went in there, never opened that door, because doing so would mean accepting that she was really gone. But that afternoon, I walked down the hallway and saw the door standing wide open, light from the window spilling out into the corridor, and there was a man sitting on her bed. He was wearing my father's old flannel shirt, the red and black one with the torn pocket that I had thrown away years ago. His back was to me, and his shoulders were hunched forward in that familiar way my father used to sit when he was drinking, curled in on himself like he was trying to disappear. I stood in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak, watching this stranger who had somehow gotten into my house and dressed himself in my dead father's clothes. When he turned to look at me, his face was wrong. The features were close enough to make my chest tight, but the eyes were too far apart, and the nose was crooked in a way my father's had never been. He smiled at me with my father's mouth and said my name in my father's voice, and something inside me snapped clean in half. I do not remember going to the garage. I do not remember picking up the crowbar that I kept next to the toolbox, the heavy iron one with the curved end that my father used to pry open stuck windows. What I remember is standing over the man on my mother's bed, the crowbar slick in my grip, his face no longer smiling. He had his hands up in front of him, palms out, and he was saying something I could not understand. The words did not make sense. They were not my father's words, not the slurred accusations and bitter disappointments I had grown up hearing. This man was begging. He was crying. He kept saying a name that was not mine, kept asking for someone called Marcy, kept telling me he was sorry, and that he did not mean to scare anyone. But I knew what he was. I knew he had come into my home wearing my dead father's face, trying to trick me, trying to break into the careful order I had built to survive. The first swing caught him across the forearm, and I heard the bone crack like a dry branch. The second one hit his shoulder as he tried to roll away from me. By the third, he had stopped begging and started screaming, and by the fourth, he had stopped making any sound at all. The silence afterward was different from any silence I had known before. It was absolute, complete, like the house itself had been holding its breath, and finally exhaled. I stood there looking down at what I had done, at the red spreading across my mother's white bedspread, at the shape that no longer looked anything like my father. My arms ached from the effort and my breathing was ragged, but my mind was perfectly clear. I felt calm. I felt in control. The intruder was dead and my home was safe again, and all I needed to do now was clean up the mess before anyone found out what had happened. I wrapped him in the bedspread first, rolling him up like a carpet the way I had seen in movies, and I dragged him down the hallway to the basement door. The stairs were narrow and steep, but I managed, letting gravity do most of the work, listening to the dull thump of his weight against each step. I buried him in the dirt floor at the back of the basement, behind the old furnace where my father used to hide his bottles from my mother. It took me 3 hours to dig a hole deep enough, and by the time I finished, my palms were blistered and my back was screaming. But I did it. I covered him up and tamped down the earth and spread some old boxes over the spot to hide the disturbed soil. Then I went upstairs and started cleaning. I thought it was over. I spent the rest of that evening scrubbing blood from the hardwood floors, washing the walls where splatter had reached, burning the crowbar handle in the backyard fire pit along with my stained clothes. The smell of bleach filled every room in the house, so strong it made my eyes water, but I kept going until there was no trace left of what had happened. I remade my mother's bed with fresh sheets from the linen closet, sheets she had bought years ago and never used, still in their original plastic packaging. I vacuumed the hallway carpet 3 times. I checked every lock, every window, every possible entry point. By midnight, the house was cleaner than it had been in years, and I sat down at the kitchen table with a glass of water and let myself breathe. The man in my mother's room had been an intruder, I told myself. A home invader who had studied my family somehow, learned their faces, their mannerisms, tried to use that knowledge to manipulate me. I had defended myself. I had protected my home. Anyone would have done the same thing in my position. I repeated these words like a prayer until I almost believed them, until the trembling in my hands finally stopped, and I could close my eyes without seeing his face. But she came back the next morning. I woke up just after dawn to the sound of someone humming in the kitchen, a melody I recognized instantly, because my mother used to hum it while she made breakfast. It was an old hymn, something about gathering at the river, and she always hummed it slightly off-key in a way that used to make my father roll his eyes. I lay in bed, listening to that sound, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, telling myself it was impossible. The man was dead. I had buried him myself. There was no one else in the house, no one who could know that song or hum it in that particular way. But when I finally gathered the courage to walk down the stairs, I found a woman standing at the stove with her back to me. She was wearing my mother's old blue robe, the one with the worn elbows and the coffee stain on the sleeve. Her hair was gray and thin, pinned up in a loose bun the way my mother used to wear hers. She turned when she heard me on the stairs, and her face was almost right. Almost. The shape of the jaw was too narrow and the wrinkles fell in slightly different patterns, but the eyes were the same pale blue I remembered from my childhood. She smiled at me and asked if I wanted eggs for breakfast, and her voice was so close to my mother's that I had to grab the banister to keep from falling. This time I did not hesitate. I walked past her to the kitchen drawer where I kept a utility knife, the kind with the retractable blade that I used to open packages. She watched me with that almost familiar face, still smiling, still holding a spatula in one hand like she belonged there. She asked me what was wrong, called me Tommy Bird again, said I looked pale and maybe I should sit down and eat something. The sound of that name in her mouth made something in my chest turn to ice. I told her to stop. I told her I knew what she was, that she and the man from yesterday were part of some sick game, some conspiracy to drive me insane by wearing the faces of my dead family. She looked confused, genuinely confused, and she put down the spatula and took a step toward me with her hands raised like she was approaching a frightened animal. She said her name was Barbara. She said she lived 2 streets over, and she had seen my door open and thought maybe I needed help. She said she was sorry if she scared me, that she only wanted to make sure I was okay. But I could see through the disguise now, see the wrongness underneath the surface, the way her movements were just slightly off from the way my mother used to move. I did not let her finish her sentence. The neighbors called the police because of the smell. It took them almost 2 weeks to notice. 2 weeks during which I barely ate or slept, spending every hour patrolling my house for more intruders, more imposters wearing the faces of people I had loved and lost. I had buried Barbara next to the man in the basement, in the dirt floor that was becoming crowded with my family's false reflections. I stopped going outside. I stopped answering emails. I sat in the dark with every curtain drawn, listening to the house settle around me, waiting for the next one to appear. When the police finally knocked on my door, I opened it calmly and invited them inside. I showed them everything. I explained about the intruders, about the disguises, about the careful psychological warfare being waged against me by forces I did not understand. I showed them the graves in the basement and waited for them to congratulate me on defending my home. Instead, they put me in handcuffs and read me my rights, and one of the officers had to step outside to vomit in my mother's rose bushes. The smell was worse than I had realized. I had gotten used to it, the way you get used to anything when you live with it long enough. The man I killed was named Raymond Vickers. He was 61 years old, a retired electrician from 2 towns over who suffered from early-onset dementia. His daughter had reported him missing 3 days before I found him in my mother's room. The police think he wandered into my house through the basement door, which had a faulty latch I never bothered to fix. He was not wearing my father's shirt. He was wearing a red flannel he had owned for years, one his wife bought him for Christmas back in 2015. Barbara Ostrowski was 73, a widow who lived alone and spent her mornings walking the neighborhood looking for people to talk to. She had seen my front door standing open and come inside to check on me, the way a kind person does when they worry about their neighbors. She was not wearing my mother's robe. She was wearing her own blue housecoat, the one her granddaughter gave her for her birthday. I learned all of this during the trial, sitting in a courtroom while lawyers showed photographs and read statements, and tried to explain to a jury why 2 innocent people were buried in my basement. I wanted to tell them they were wrong, that Raymond and Barbara were imposters sent to torment me, but my attorney advised me to stay quiet and let the psychiatrists do the talking. I am writing this from a room with a locked door and a small window that looks out onto a concrete courtyard. The doctors here have given my condition a name, something long and clinical that I cannot remember how to spell. They say I constructed an elaborate delusion to justify acts of violence that came from somewhere deep inside me, somewhere I never knew existed. They say the isolation broke something in my brain, or maybe revealed something that was always broken. They say I am not evil, just sick, and with the right medication and therapy, I might someday understand what I did. But here is the thing that keeps me awake at night, staring at the ceiling while the pills wear off and the darkness presses in. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. That man smiled at me with my father's mouth. That woman hummed my mother's song. They called me by a name that nobody else in the world has ever used. The doctors tell me my mind created those details, filled in the gaps with memories I desperately wanted to believe. Maybe they are right. Maybe I am exactly what they say I am. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door. I hear someone humming an old hymn about gathering at the river, and I wonder if they ever really stopped coming for me, or if they are just waiting for me to be alone again. Nobody tells you how much of your dignity you lose when you become a patient. I had been dealing with lupus for about 6 years by the time they transferred me to St. Matthias Regional in late October 2017. My rheumatologist back home in Tennessee had done her best, but my kidneys were starting to show signs of involvement, and she wanted me under the care of someone who specialized in autoimmune nephrology. The name Dr. Wesley Pratt came up almost immediately. The man had published dozens of papers, trained at Johns Hopkins, and had this reputation that made nurses speak about him in hushed, reverent tones. When I found out I was being assigned to his care, I remember feeling relieved. My mom called crying happy tears. We thought I had won some kind of lottery. I was 34, scared out of my mind about what was happening to my body, and I genuinely believed this man was going to save me. The first week, everything seemed perfect. He was attentive, thorough, asked questions nobody had ever thought to ask. I told my husband Greg on the phone that I finally felt like I was in good hands. The shift happened so gradually that I almost missed it. Around the second week of my stay, I started noticing small things. My evening medication, which I had been taking at 8 for years, kept arriving late. Sometimes 9, sometimes closer to 10. When I mentioned it to the nurses, they just said Dr. Pratt had adjusted the schedule. Fine, I thought. He knows best. But then my prednisone dosage changed without anyone telling me. I only realized because the pills looked different, smaller than usual. I asked about it during rounds, and Dr. Pratt gave me this patient smile and said they were trying a new protocol, that I should trust the process. His tone was calm, almost fatherly, but something in his eyes made me uncomfortable. Not cruel exactly, more like distant, clinical in a way that felt too detached. The other patients in my ward, mostly women around my age dealing with similar conditions, seemed to adore him. Janet, the woman in the room next to mine, called him a godsend. But I started keeping a little notebook by my bed. Dates, times, what pills I received, how I felt after. I told myself I was being paranoid. I really wanted to believe that. The third week is when Janet got worse. She had been doing well, or at least that is what everyone kept saying. Her color was good. She was walking the halls with me in the afternoons, talking about her grandkids back in Georgia. Then one morning I woke up to commotion outside my room. Nurses rushing past, that urgent but controlled pace they use when something is really wrong. Janet had crashed overnight. Kidney failure, they said. Acute and sudden. I remember standing in my doorway watching them wheel her to the ICU, and Dr. Pratt was right there, his face grave and concerned, speaking softly to her daughter who had arrived in a panic. He looked like a man who genuinely cared. But later that day, when he came to check on me, I noticed something that made my chest tight. He asked how I was feeling, the usual questions, but then he paused and looked at my notebook on the bedside table. Just for a second. His expression did not change, but he asked what I was writing. I said it was just a journal, personal stuff to pass the time. He nodded and smiled, said that was healthy, keeping the mind active. But when he left, I noticed my notebook had been moved slightly. The pen was on the wrong side. I started paying closer attention to everything after that. The ward had about 12 patients, all women, all dealing with chronic autoimmune conditions. Most of us were long-term, weeks or months of treatment. I began talking to the others more, casual conversations in the common room or during our slow shuffles down the corridor. What I found out made me uneasy. Donna, a 46-year-old with scleroderma, told me her symptoms had gotten mysteriously worse since arriving, despite the aggressive treatment plan. She was losing weight, could not keep food down, and nobody could explain why. Yolanda, who had been there the longest, almost 3 months, said she had filed a complaint early on about her medication being inconsistent, but nothing ever came of it. When I asked if she had talked to Dr. Pratt about it, she just shrugged and said he always had an explanation. He always had data to back it up, charts and numbers and test results that made you feel stupid for questioning him. The man had an answer for everything, delivered with that same patient, almost paternal tone. I started to wonder if the answers were actually true, or if we were all just too sick and too scared to push back. My own body started betraying me around day 19. I woke up with joint pain so severe I could barely move my fingers. This was not normal for me, not even during my worst flares back home. My face was puffy, my ankles swollen, and when I urinated, there was a dark tint that scared me. I pressed the call button and waited, and waited. It took almost 40 minutes for someone to come, a young nurse named Brooke, who looked genuinely apologetic. She said they were short-staffed, took my vitals, and promised to page Dr. Pratt. He showed up 2 hours later, unhurried, clipboard in hand. I told him everything, described each symptom in detail, and he listened with that composed expression of his. Then he said it was likely just a reaction to the treatment adjustment, that my body was recalibrating. He used that word, recalibrating, like I was a machine. When I pushed harder, asked to see my lab results from the past week, he tilted his head slightly and said patients reviewing their own charts often led to unnecessary anxiety. He recommended I focus on rest and trust the process. That phrase again, trust the process. I wanted to scream at him, but I was too weak and too afraid of being labeled difficult. In hospitals, being difficult can get you dismissed or ignored, and I knew I could not afford that. That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about Janet in the ICU, about Donna losing weight she could not afford to lose, about Yolanda filing complaints that went nowhere. Around 2 in the morning, I got out of bed and walked to the nurse's station. The ward was quiet, that strange hospital quiet where machines hum and fluorescent lights buzz, and everything feels suspended. There was only one nurse on duty, an older woman I had not seen before, and she was busy with paperwork. I told her I needed to use the bathroom down the hall, which was technically true, but on my way back I stopped by the small records room near the station. The door was ajar. I do not know what made me do it, maybe desperation or maybe just the feeling that something was deeply wrong and I needed proof. I slipped inside and found the filing cabinets organized by room number. My file was thin, which surprised me, but what I saw inside made everything click into place. The medication logs did not match what I had been receiving. According to my chart, I was on the standard immunosuppressant protocol, but the pills I had been given, the ones I had documented in my notebook with descriptions and timestamps, were different. Smaller doses, different colors. Someone had been altering my treatment while the official records showed everything was normal. I stood there in that dim records room with my heart pounding so loud I was sure someone would hear it. My first instinct was to take the file, to have proof, but I knew that would be noticed immediately. Instead, I pulled out my phone and took pictures of every page. Then, because I could not stop myself, I looked at Janet's file. Hers was thicker, months of documentation, and as I flipped through, I saw a pattern that made me feel sick. Her immunosuppressants had been reduced 3 times over the past 8 weeks, each time with a note signed by Dr. Pratt citing patient tolerance concerns. But Janet had never complained about side effects. She told me herself that she felt fine on her medication, that it was finally working after years of struggling. I checked Donna's file next, then Yolanda's. The same pattern. Dosage reductions, medication switches, always with clinical justifications that sounded reasonable on paper, but did not match what the patients themselves reported. I took pictures of everything I could, my fingers clumsy and trembling with fear and adrenaline. I must have been in there for 15 minutes when I heard footsteps in the corridor. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I shoved the files back into the cabinet and pressed myself against the wall behind the door, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped right outside. I could see a shadow through the crack in the door, someone standing there, not moving. Seconds passed that felt like hours. Then the shadow moved on, and I heard a door open and close further down the hall. I waited another 5 minutes before slipping out and making my way back to my room. I did not sleep at all that night. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, going through the photos on my phone over and over, trying to make sense of what I had found. In the morning, during rounds, Dr. Pratt came to see me as usual. He asked how I slept, checked my vitals, made notes on his tablet. Everything normal, everything routine. But right before he left, he paused at the door and turned back to me. He said he noticed I had been up late, that the night nurse mentioned seeing me in the hallway. His voice was casual, friendly even, but his eyes held mine for just a beat too long. He said I should be careful, that wandering around at night was not good for my recovery. Then he smiled, wished me a good day, and left. I understood the message perfectly. He knew. Maybe not exactly what I had seen, but he knew I was looking. And that smile, that calm and professional smile, was a warning. I called Greg that afternoon and told him everything. He wanted to drive up immediately, pull me out of there, but I begged him to wait. If I left against medical advice, my insurance would not cover the treatment I desperately needed, and we were already drowning in medical debt. Instead, I asked him to contact a patient advocate and maybe a lawyer, someone who could look at the photos I had taken and tell us what to do. He agreed, but I could hear the fear in his voice, the helplessness of being 3 hours away, while his wife was trapped in a place that was supposed to heal her. After we hung up, I tried to act normal. I went to the common room, talked to Donna about her daughter's wedding, smiled at the nurses, ate my bland hospital lunch. But I noticed things I'd missed before. The way certain nurses avoided eye contact with Dr. Pratt. The way one of the younger residents, a woman named Shaw, always seemed tense during rounds. Her jaw tight, her responses clipped. I tried to approach her later that day, caught her alone by the vending machines. I asked if I could talk to her privately about my care. She looked at me with something like panic in her eyes and said I should direct all questions to Dr. Pratt. Then she walked away so fast she almost ran. That told me more than any file could. The staff knew. Maybe not all of them. Maybe not the details, but enough of them knew something was wrong and they were too scared or too complicit to speak up. The retaliation started the next morning. A nurse I had never seen before came in at 6 to draw blood, said it was for additional testing ordered by Dr. Pratt. She took 4 vials, which seemed excessive, but what could I say? An hour later, another nurse came with new medication, pills I did not recognize. When I asked what they were, she checked her chart and said it was a new anti-inflammatory, that Dr. Pratt had added it to my regimen. I pretended to take them, tucked them under my tongue and spit them out as soon as she left. I hid them in my pillowcase, planning to have them analyzed later. By noon, I was called for an unscheduled MRI, then an ultrasound, then more blood work. I spent the entire day being shuttled from one test to another, exhausted, dehydrated, my veins bruised from needles. Nobody would tell me what they were looking for. Every time I asked, I got the same answer. Dr. Pratt ordered it. By evening, I was too weak to eat. I just lay in my bed watching the door, flinching every time someone walked past. Greg texted to say the lawyer wanted to see the photos but needed more context. I started typing out everything I knew, every suspicion, every piece of evidence. But my vision was blurring and my fingers would not cooperate. Something was wrong with me, worse than before, and I knew it was not my lupus. It was him. He was doing something to me, and I could not prove it fast enough. What saved me was Greg ignoring my advice. He drove up that night without telling me, walked into the hospital around 10, and demanded to see me. When I heard his voice in the hallway arguing with a nurse, I started crying. He found me in my room looking like death, his words not mine, and he lost it. He started taking pictures of my bruised arms, the untouched food trays, my swollen face. He called the hospital administrator's emergency line and threatened to contact the state medical board, local news, anyone who would listen. Within an hour, there were people in my room I had never seen before. An administrator, a different doctor, someone from patient relations. Dr. Pratt was notably absent. They ran new tests, real tests this time, and found that my potassium levels were dangerously low, that I was severely dehydrated, that my kidney function had declined significantly since admission. The new doctor, a woman named Schultz who looked horrified as she reviewed my chart, ordered IV fluids and adjusted my medications immediately. She kept asking who had authorized certain tests, certain drugs, and nobody could give her a straight answer. I was transferred to a different hospital 2 days later, and I have never set foot in St. Matthias again. Here is the part that still keeps me awake. Nothing happened to Dr. Wesley Pratt. My lawyer sent the photos and documentation to the medical board, and an investigation was supposedly opened. But months passed with no updates. When I finally got a response, it said the investigation found insufficient evidence of misconduct. The official records, the ones he controlled, showed that my care had been appropriate and within standard protocols. My word against his, my little notebook against his decades of published research and sterling reputation. Janet died 6 weeks after I left, kidney failure listed as the cause. Donna was discharged and passed away at home 3 months later, complications from her condition. Yolanda, I never heard from again. I looked up Dr. Pratt last year just to see. He is still practicing, still publishing papers, still receiving awards. His photo on the hospital website shows him smiling, that same calm, patient smile, surrounded by grateful testimonials from patients who credit him with saving their lives. And maybe he did save some of them. Maybe that is what makes it so terrifying. He gets to choose. He sits in that white coat, behind that clipboard, and he decides who gets better and who does not. I cannot explain why he targeted us, what he got out of watching us deteriorate under his care. Control, maybe. Curiosity. The thrill of holding life in his hands and squeezing just to see what happens. I do not know. All I know is that I got out because my husband made noise, because he refused to be polite about it. And I think about all the patients who do not have someone like that, who are alone and scared and trusting the process like they are told. I think about them more than I should. April of 2018 found me celebrating 10 years at Whitmore Financial, a mid-sized accounting firm in Nashville, where I had clawed my way up from entry-level analyst to senior account manager. My daughter had just turned 7 that spring, and my wife and I were finally talking about buying a bigger house now that the student loans were paid off. Life felt stable in a way it never had before. I remember thinking I had figured out the formula. Show up early, leave late, keep your head down, do good work, and the company would take care of you. The corner office on the 4th floor had my name written all over it, at least in my mind. I had earned the trust of 3 different supervisors over the decade, survived 2 rounds of layoffs, and built a reputation as the guy who could fix any account that went sideways. That version of me seems almost naive now, like watching home videos of someone who has no idea what is coming. Our department head, a gruff but fair man named Phil Buckner who had mentored me since my 2nd year, announced his early retirement at the end of March. Heart problems, he said, though I suspected his wife had finally convinced him that 60-hour weeks were not worth the corner office. The company brought in his replacement within 2 weeks, a woman named Vanessa Cole, who came with glowing recommendations from a competitor firm in Atlanta. She was maybe 40, always impeccably dressed, with this calm and measured way of speaking that made everything sound reasonable. During her first week, she made a point of meeting with each team member individually, asking about our goals, our families, our concerns about the department. I walked out of that meeting feeling optimistic. She had listened intently, taken notes, asked follow-up questions about my daughter. It felt like the kind of leadership transition that might actually improve things. I had no way of knowing that our conversation had been a reconnaissance mission, that she was mapping out exactly which pressure points would work best when the time came to dismantle everything I had built. The first incident happened about 3 weeks into her tenure, small enough that I almost dismissed it entirely. I had been working on the Pemberton account, a difficult client who required constant hand-holding and precise documentation. Vanessa had sent me an email on a Tuesday asking for a status update by end of week, which I delivered Thursday afternoon, a full day early. The following Monday, during our team meeting, she mentioned casually that she was concerned about the Pemberton timeline, noting that she had requested the update by Wednesday, and it had arrived late. I opened my mouth to correct her, but she had already moved on to the next agenda item, her tone light and unbothered. After the meeting, I checked my email to confirm the original deadline. Friday. She had clearly written Friday. I almost forwarded it to her as a polite correction, but something made me hesitate. Instead, I took a screenshot and saved it to a folder on my desktop. It felt paranoid at the time, like I was overreacting to a simple miscommunication. That folder would grow thick with screenshots over the coming months. 2 weeks later, I was called into a meeting with Vanessa and the HR representative, a nervous young man named Jerome who kept adjusting his glasses. Vanessa explained, with genuine-sounding concern in her voice, that a coworker had reported feeling uncomfortable with some comments I had allegedly made about workload distribution. She would not tell me who had complained or what exactly I had said, citing confidentiality, but she wanted me to know that she took these matters seriously and hoped we could move forward with better communication. I sat there stunned, running through every conversation I could remember from the past month. I had made no comments about workload to anyone except my closest work friend, Dale Hoffman, and those had been standard venting sessions in the break room about nothing in particular. When I tried to ask clarifying questions, Vanessa smiled warmly and said she was sure it was just a misunderstanding, that she was not looking to make a big deal of it, that she simply wanted to keep me informed. Jerome nodded along without ever meeting my eyes. I left that meeting feeling like I had been accused of a crime without being told what the crime was, and the worst part was how reasonable Vanessa had made the whole thing sound. I started paying closer attention after that, and once I knew what to look for, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Small things kept happening, each one deniable on its own, but adding up to something deliberate. I would be left off email chains about projects I was leading, then questioned about why I had not contributed to discussions I never knew were happening. Meeting times would shift without anyone notifying me directly, and I would arrive to find my colleagues already mid-conversation, Vanessa offering a sympathetic look and saying she was sure someone had told me. My access to certain shared files was revoked due to what IT called a system glitch, though it took 2 weeks and 3 help desk tickets to restore. One afternoon, I overheard 2 junior analysts whispering near the elevator, and when I approached, they went quiet in a way that made my chest tighten. I asked Dale about it later, and he hesitated before saying that Vanessa had mentioned in a sidebar that I was going through some personal issues and that the team should be patient with me. Personal issues. I had never told her anything about personal issues because there were none to tell. She was inventing a version of me and distributing it like a memo. The isolation was the hardest part to explain to my wife, Colleen. I mean, not Colleen. Her name is Laura. Sorry, I get mixed up sometimes even now when I think about that period. I would come home and try to describe what was happening, but it sounded paranoid even to my own ears. My boss changed a deadline and then said she did not. A coworker filed a vague complaint that nobody will explain. These were not the kinds of problems that translated well over dinner. Laura would listen patiently, suggest that maybe Vanessa was just disorganized. Maybe there had been genuine miscommunication. Maybe I should give it more time. And part of me wanted to believe that, wanted to accept the simpler explanation. But I could see the doubt creeping into my wife's eyes when I brought it up too often. The way she would change the subject to our daughter's school play or the leak in the basement. I started keeping things to myself, partly because I did not want to sound crazy, and partly because I was starting to wonder if maybe I was. That is what this kind of thing does to you. It makes you question your own memory, your own perception, your own sanity. And looking back, I think that was exactly the point. By June, I had assembled a folder with over 40 screenshots, saved emails, and time-stamped notes documenting every incident I could catch. I felt like a detective building a case, except the case was my own professional survival. Dale was the only person at work I trusted enough to confide in, and one Thursday after everyone else had left, I showed him the folder. His face went through several expressions as he scrolled through the evidence. Confusion, then recognition, then something that looked a lot like fear. He admitted that he had noticed some of the same patterns, that Vanessa had asked him pointed questions about my work habits and my attitude, questions that seemed designed to elicit negative responses. But he also told me something that made my throat go dry. Vanessa had already spoken to him privately about her concerns regarding my performance, framing it as a confidential discussion about how to support a struggling colleague. She had painted a picture of someone falling apart, missing deadlines, alienating coworkers, possibly dealing with substance issues. Dale said he had pushed back, told her that did not match the person he knew, but she had just nodded sympathetically and thanked him for his loyalty. The word she used was loyalty, like defending a friend of 10 years was some kind of character flaw. I decided to go to HR directly, bypassing Vanessa entirely. I spent a weekend organizing my documentation into a clear timeline, printing everything out in case digital files could be altered or deleted. Monday morning, I requested a meeting with the head of human resources, a woman named Diane Prescott, who had been with the company almost as long as I had. I sat in her office and laid it all out. The changed deadlines, the phantom complaints, the whispering campaigns, the systematic exclusion. I showed her the emails with timestamps that contradicted Vanessa's claims. I kept my voice steady even though my heart was pounding against my ribs like it wanted to escape. Diane listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she thanked me for bringing this to her attention and said she would look into it. There was something in her tone, though, a careful neutrality that felt rehearsed. As I stood to leave, she asked me one question that I still remember word for word. She asked if I had been feeling overwhelmed lately, if everything was okay at home. I realized then, standing in that doorway, that Vanessa had already been there. Whatever story she had told, it had arrived before me and laid the groundwork. I was not reporting a problem. I was confirming a diagnosis. The next 2 weeks were the longest of my life. Diane never followed up with me directly, but I noticed changes in how people behaved around the office. Conversations would stop when I approached the coffee machine. Colleagues who had known me for years suddenly had somewhere else to be when I tried to chat. Even Dale started keeping his distance, and when I finally cornered him in the parking garage, he looked genuinely scared. He told me that Vanessa had called a private meeting with the team while I was out at a client site. She had expressed deep concern about my mental state, mentioned that HR was aware of the situation, and asked everyone to document any unusual behavior they observed. She framed it as looking out for me, protecting me, making sure I got the help I needed. Dale said a few people had pushed back, asked what specifically was wrong, but Vanessa had demurred, citing privacy. The genius of it was almost beautiful in a horrible way. She never had to accuse me of anything concrete. She just created an atmosphere where everyone was watching, waiting for me to slip, interpreting every normal action through the lens of someone who was supposedly unraveling. I could feel their eyes on me in meetings, tracking my reactions, noting when I seemed frustrated or tired. Being observed like that changes how you move, how you speak, how you breathe. You become a performance of sanity, which somehow makes you feel less sane. I stopped sleeping through the night. I would lie awake running through scenarios, trying to figure out what I had done to make Vanessa target me, whether there was some offense I had committed without realizing. Laura grew more worried, and our conversations became careful in a way they had never been before. She suggested I see someone, a therapist, just to talk things through. I almost laughed at the irony. Vanessa had successfully exported her narrative into my own home. My daughter started asking why Daddy was sad all the time, and I did not have an answer that made sense to a 7-year-old. How do you explain that there is a person at work who is trying to convince everyone you are crazy, and the harder you try to prove you are not, the crazier you look? I started making mistakes for real then, small ones, the kind that come from exhaustion and constant anxiety. A misplaced decimal on a report, a client call I forgot to return. Each one felt like handing Vanessa another piece of ammunition. I was trapped in a machine of her design, and every movement I made only pulled the gears tighter. The worst part was that she remained unfailingly pleasant to my face, always asking how I was doing with that same warm concern, always offering to help if I needed anything. Sometimes I caught myself almost grateful for her kindness, before remembering that she was the one who had made me need it. The breaking point came on a Wednesday in late July, the kind of humid Nashville afternoon where the air feels like a wet blanket. Vanessa called me into her office and closed the door with a soft click that somehow sounded final. She sat across from me with a folder in her hands, My folder, I realized, the performance reviews and incident reports she had been compiling. Her voice was gentle as she explained that several team members had expressed concerns, that HR had documented a pattern of erratic behavior, that upper management felt it might be best for everyone if we discussed a transition plan. She used words like mutual and supportive and fresh start, but what she meant was that I was done. 10 years of my life erased by 3 months of carefully orchestrated destruction. I sat there listening to her dismantle my career with the same pleasant tone she used to ask about my daughter, and something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the absurdity of the moment, or maybe I had simply run out of fear. I asked her directly, looking straight into her eyes, why she had done this to me. Not what had I done wrong, not how could we fix it, but why. She held my gaze for a long moment, and I saw something flicker behind her professional mask. Not guilt, not embarrassment, but something cold and satisfied, like a cat watching a mouse finally stop running. Then she smiled and said she did not understand what I meant, that she had only ever tried to help me, that she hoped I would get the support I clearly needed. It was the most honest dishonesty I had ever witnessed. I did not fight the termination. Part of me wanted to hire a lawyer and expose everything, but I knew how it would look. A disgruntled employee with documented mental health concerns making wild accusations against a well-respected supervisor. The narrative was already written, and I was not the author. I took the severance package and signed the papers that said I would not disparage the company. Laura held me that night while I explained what had happened, and for the first time since this all started, she believed me completely. Maybe because she could finally see the full picture, or maybe because losing my job made the stakes real in a way my paranoid-sounding complaints never had. I spent the next 6 months rebuilding, finding a new position at a smaller firm where nobody knew my name or my supposed history of instability. I still think about Vanessa sometimes, wonder if she has done this before, if she is doing it to someone else right now. I looked her up online once and found a glowing profile in a business magazine, an interview where she talked about the importance of employee wellness and creating supportive work environments. I had to close my laptop and walk away before I put my fist through the screen. What I learned from that experience is something I wish I had never needed to know, that there are people in this world who will destroy you not out of anger or revenge, but simply because they can. Because it serves some purpose you will never understand, and they will do it with a smile that makes everyone else think they are the hero of the story. That winter, life felt small and repetitive in my town, the kind of place where everyone recognizes your truck before they remember your name. I was working long shifts at a local supply store, saving money and trying to keep my head down after a rough year. Most days followed the same rhythm: early mornings, dusty shelves, familiar faces, and the quiet comfort of routine. People here value predictability, and anything that breaks it gets noticed fast. I didn't have many close friends, just coworkers I nodded to and neighbors I waved at from a distance. The town itself felt frozen in time, and I thought that made it safe. Looking back, that sense of safety was mostly an illusion built on habit. There was a guy everyone knew who spent a lot of time at the store next door, a family-owned diner that doubled as the town's social hub. His name was Evan, and he stood out without really trying. He wore the same faded jacket year-round and talked a little too loud, laughing at his own jokes before anyone else could react. He wasn't threatening, just awkward, always hovering near booths where he wasn't invited. Some people were polite, others clearly annoyed, but nobody took him seriously enough to really engage. I'd see him staring at people longer than necessary, like he was trying to memorize how they reacted to him. At the time, it felt uncomfortable but harmless, just another odd character in a small town. Over time, the complaints started stacking up, mostly whispers at first and then angry conversations behind closed doors. The diner owners finally called the local authorities after Evan refused to leave one afternoon and caused a scene over a seat he thought was his. Word spread fast, as it always does, and soon everyone knew he'd been escorted out and warned not to come back. I remember seeing him outside later that day, pacing near the parking lot, his face red and his jaw clenched. He kept muttering to himself, pointing at the windows as people ate inside. Something about the way he looked at that building made my chest feel tight, like he was nursing a wound nobody else could see. Still, most of us assumed he'd disappear and move on. The day everything happened started like any other, quiet and gray, with the town waking up slowly. I stopped by the diner before work, thinking about nothing more than coffee and breakfast. Conversations were low, plates clinked, and the smell of grease hung in the air. A few regulars joked about how peaceful it felt without Evan around, which earned some nervous laughs. I remember noticing how calm everyone seemed, as if a problem had already been solved just by removing it from sight. None of us realized how much anger had been building outside our routines, waiting for a reason to come back inside. I had just finished eating when the front door swung open harder than usual, the bell above it ringing sharp and uneven. Evan stood there, looking thinner somehow, like the weeks away had stripped something from him. His jacket was gone, replaced by a dark hoodie that didn't quite fit right, sleeves hanging past his wrists. He scanned the room slowly, not like someone searching for a seat, but like someone counting. The chatter faded into an uneasy hush, forks pausing halfway to mouths. I remember the smell of burnt coffee suddenly feeling stronger, almost sour, as if the air itself had changed. No one greeted him and no one told him to leave. He started talking, not shouting at first, but speaking with a strange certainty, naming people like he was reading from a list. He accused them of laughing at him, of looking down on him, of pretending he didn't exist. His voice cracked in places, then steadied again, sharper each time. I noticed his eyes were glassy but focused, locked on faces that had clearly forgotten him already. When someone told him to calm down, he laughed, a quick sound that didn't match the situation. That was when he reached inside his hoodie, and the room seemed to shrink around us. Chairs scraped back, and a few people bolted for the side door. The noise that followed was loud and chaotic, nothing like movies or news clips make it seem. I dropped behind the counter instinctively, my ears ringing as people screamed and ducked. From where I was crouched, I could see Evan's shoes pacing back and forth, steady steps like he was on a schedule. He kept talking between shots, rambling about respect and being pushed aside, about how everyone would remember him now. The sound of breaking glass mixed with cries and the metallic echo of something hitting tile. Time lost its shape, stretching and snapping in ways I still struggle to explain. Eventually, sirens cut through the chaos, growing louder until they drowned everything else out. Evan stopped moving, his voice fading into incoherent muttering before going silent. When officers rushed in, shouting commands, the diner looked unrecognizable, smoke hanging low and chairs overturned like fallen bodies. I stayed on the floor until someone touched my shoulder and told me it was over. Walking outside, the cold air burned my lungs, and the town felt unfamiliar, like a place I'd never truly known. People stood in clusters, crying, staring, trying to make sense of something that had no simple explanation. In the days that followed, the town moved in a strange, muted rhythm, like everyone was afraid of making noise. News vans showed up, then left, and the diner stayed closed with paper taped over the windows. People replayed moments in their heads, wondering which small interaction had mattered more than they thought. I kept remembering Evan standing there, counting faces, as if he'd been building that list for a long time. Sleep didn't come easy, and when it did, it brought fragments of sound and light that snapped me awake. Conversations felt forced, heavy with things nobody knew how to say out loud. It became clear that pretending someone is harmless doesn't make them harmless. Authorities released bits of information slowly, talking about how Evan had been removed after multiple complaints, and how he'd fixated on the idea of being wronged. They used words like grievance and isolation, explaining patterns most of us had never wanted to see up close. What hit me hardest was learning how often he'd come back after being banned, standing outside and watching people eat. He had written notes about who sat where and who avoided eye contact. None of that sounded like madness in the way people imagine it. just obsession left alone for too long. The town had treated him like background noise until he made himself impossible to ignore. I went back to the diner weeks later when it reopened. Stepping inside felt heavier than I expected. The layout had changed. New glass, different tables, as if rearranging things could reset what happened there. Some of the regulars never returned, and others sat quietly, eyes down, eating in silence. The owners thanked everyone for coming back, voices tight with emotion, trying to sound normal. Sitting there, I realized how easily routines can hide danger, how comfort can turn into blindness. Evan wasn't born into that moment. It was shaped by years of being dismissed, and none of us noticed the pressure building. What stays with me now isn't just the violence, but the warning signs that were visible in hindsight. The way resentment grew into entitlement, how fixation fed on every perceived slight. I still live here, still work nearby, but I pay attention differently. When someone lingers too long, when anger simmers instead of fading, I don't brush it off anymore. This story doesn't have a clean lesson or a neat explanation, just a reminder of how quickly neglect can turn into tragedy. The town healed enough to function, but it never returned to what it was. Some things, once broken, only settle into a new shape. Early that spring, my routine felt stable in the quiet way routines usually do. I worked a standard office job, lived alone in a small apartment, and spent most evenings either cooking or unwinding at the gym a few blocks away. Life wasn't exciting, but it was predictable, and that predictability mattered to me more than I realized at the time. The gym was familiar territory, a place where faces blurred together and conversations stayed light. I kept to myself, nodded at people I recognized, and left without lingering. That's where I met her during one of those forgettable moments that usually disappear from memory. We shared a quick conversation near the water fountain. Nothing personal, nothing intense. At least that's how it felt to me in that moment. Her name was Megan, and she had an easy way of talking, the kind that makes silence feel unnecessary. She mentioned the weather, asked if I'd tried the new rowing machines, laughed at something I said that wasn't really a joke. The interaction lasted maybe 3 minutes, then we went our separate ways. I remember thinking she seemed friendly in a generic way, like dozens of people I'd crossed paths with before. There was no exchange of numbers, no plans to meet again, nothing that felt like the beginning of anything. I finished my workout and went home without giving it another thought. That night passed normally, and so did the next morning. Looking back, that's the part that unsettles me most, how ordinary everything still felt. A few days later, small things started to register in my mind. Not alarms, just mild friction against the day. While waiting in line for coffee, I caught the sensation of being observed, not stared at directly, but noticed. On my commute, the same car appeared behind me twice in different parts of town, which I brushed off as coincidence. An anonymous message showed up on my phone with no number attached, referencing a comment I'd made at the gym about hating early mornings. I assumed it was spam, maybe some marketing trick, and deleted it. That night when I got home, my apartment looked exactly as I'd left it. Still, there was a faint sense that something had shifted, like furniture moved an inch to the side. The first time I knew it wasn't nothing happened after work on a Monday evening. My keys weren't where I always dropped them, and my bathroom mirror had been wiped clean, free of the faint streaks I never bothered to fix. Inside my kitchen drawer, a receipt from weeks earlier was placed neatly on top, instead of crumpled underneath utensils. These weren't dramatic changes, just precise ones, deliberate enough to feel intentional. I stood there longer than I meant to, trying to convince myself I was misremembering. My phone buzzed again. Another message with no sender, this one mentioning the song I'd hummed while locking my door that morning. That was when the idea of coincidence finally fell apart. Something had already been paying attention far longer than I had. From that point on, my days began to feel rehearsed by someone else. I'd leave my apartment and notice the hallway light already on, even though it usually flickered and stayed dark. At work, a sticky note appeared on my desk reminding me of a meeting I hadn't told anyone about. The messages kept coming, always vague, always personal, mentioning things I said aloud only when I was alone. They never threatened me outright, which somehow made them worse. Each one read like a quiet acknowledgement, as if the sender wanted me to know I was being followed without ever admitting it. Sleep became shallow, broken by the sense that the night was no longer empty. Public spaces stopped feeling neutral. At the grocery store, I noticed Megan standing 2 aisles away, her cart barely filled, watching the shelves instead of the products. On another evening, she sat near me at the gym, stretching without earbuds, repeating a phrase I'd muttered to myself earlier that day. When our eyes met, she didn't look away quickly or awkwardly. She held my gaze calmly, almost patiently, like she expected recognition. I told myself it was paranoia, that once you notice a face, you see it everywhere. Still, my body reacted before my thoughts could catch up, tightening with every shared space. The realization that she knew my apartment came quietly. A jacket I rarely wore was folded on my couch, positioned carefully instead of tossed over the chair where I left it. The window above my sink was unlocked, even though I always latched it without thinking. I checked the locks twice that night, then a third time, standing there longer than necessary, listening. Another message arrived while I stood in the dark, commenting on the view from my living room and how peaceful it looked at night. There was no anger in the words, no excitement either, just certainty. That was when fear finally settled in, heavy and undeniable. Confrontation felt like the only way to reclaim control, even though every instinct warned against it. I sent a short reply, asking her to stop, telling her this wasn't welcome. The response came almost immediately, longer than the others, explaining that she'd been careful, respectful, patient. She wrote about how people overlook meaningful connections when they're afraid, how trust takes time, how she'd made sure I'd notice her eventually. The message ended by saying my reaction proved how deeply connected we already were, because I finally saw her. Reading it, I understood that my discomfort wasn't a misunderstanding. It was part of the plan all along. After that exchange, I stopped responding entirely. I changed my routines in small ways at first, leaving earlier, coming home later, avoiding familiar places. None of it mattered. Notes appeared in my mailbox commenting on the changes, phrased almost playfully as if she admired the effort. One message mentioned how my heartbeat sped up when I realized I was being watched, describing it in a way that suggested she'd been close enough to hear it. That detail broke something in me. It meant she wasn't just observing from a distance. She was close, blending in, timing her presence so precisely that I never noticed until she wanted me to. I decided to confront her in person, not out of bravery, but because the pressure of waiting became unbearable. The gym seemed like neutral ground, public enough to feel safe. When I approached her, she didn't look surprised. She smiled softly and spoke my name as if we'd known each other for years. I told her to leave me alone, that this had gone too far, that what she was doing was terrifying. She listened without interrupting, nodding slightly, like someone receiving feedback. When I finished, she said she understood and thanked me for being honest. Then she added that she'd prepared for this reaction, and that fear was a natural stage in closeness. Hearing that made it clear there was no version of reality where she backed away on her own. That night, I packed a bag and stayed with a coworker I barely knew, not explaining much beyond needing space. Even there, sleep didn't come easily. My phone stayed silent for hours, which somehow felt worse than the messages. Just before dawn, a final text appeared, apologizing for overwhelming me and assuring me she'd give me time. She wrote that stepping back didn't mean letting go, only waiting. I changed my number the next day, filed a report, and eventually moved. The practical steps helped, even if they didn't erase what had already happened. Years have passed and the messages never returned, at least not directly. Still, certain habits never left me. I double-check locks, notice reflections, catalog small changes in rooms without meaning to. I don't go to gyms anymore, and casual conversations with strangers carry a weight they didn't before. Nothing like that ever happened again, and maybe that's the closest thing to closure I'll get. Whatever she wanted, it stopped. Even now, I can't fully explain how someone threaded themselves into my life so quietly, or how close it came to consuming it. I only know that it ended, and that ending is the reason I can talk about it at all. That evening unfolded during a stretch of my life when routines mattered more than excitement. Work had been draining, money tight, and most days followed the same narrow path between my apartment and my job. I relied on public transportation because it was cheaper and predictable, even when it meant standing under bad weather. The rain that night came down in a steady, soaking curtain, heavy enough to blur streetlights and flatten sound. I remember thinking how empty the stop felt, like the city had decided to pause. My phone battery was low, my jacket thinner than I'd planned for, and I was already tired before anything unusual happened. All I wanted was to get home, dry off, and shut the day down quietly. Waiting there, counting the minutes between updates, I noticed him because he didn't seem bothered by the rain at all. He stood a little apart, hands folded neatly, clothes plain but clean, posture relaxed in a way that felt intentional. When he spoke, it was only to comment on the delay, his voice calm and measured, not pushing for attention. He offered me space under the small shelter without stepping closer than necessary. It felt polite in a rare way, the kind of courtesy people talk about but don't practice much anymore. I answered briefly, appreciating the normalcy of small talk in a moment that otherwise felt stalled and uncomfortable. As the wait dragged on, the rain thinning but not stopping, the conversation stretched with it. He asked where I was headed, framed casually, like anyone killing time would. When I gave a vague answer, he adjusted, asking if I lived alone or with roommates, as if he were just comparing commutes. Each question arrived wrapped in kindness, softened by a gentle tone and patient pauses. I didn't feel pressured, which is probably why I kept responding. The stop grew quieter as a couple people gave up and left, their footsteps fading into the wet street. With fewer witnesses, his attention felt more focused, less scattered by the surroundings. The shift was subtle enough that I only recognized it later, replaying the moment in my head. His questions started stacking instead of drifting, building a clearer picture of me than I'd intended to give. He noticed details I hadn't offered, like the hesitation before my answers, or how often I checked the road for headlights. The rain muffled everything, leaving his voice oddly clear in the empty space. That was when I realized his politeness wasn't meant to comfort me. It was structured, deliberate, like someone taking measurements without pulling out a ruler. And standing there soaked and alone, I understood I wasn't part of a conversation anymore. I was part of an evaluation. The shelter light flickered once, then steadied, casting a pale reflection on the wet pavement. He adjusted his stance so he was closer to the timetable sign, not blocking my exit, but positioned where he could see both ends of the street. When another delay alert chimed, he reacted before I did, explaining it in detail I hadn't asked for. His calm didn't match the situation anymore. I became aware of how quiet everything had grown, the rain now a soft hiss instead of a roar. He asked if anyone was expecting me, phrasing it like concern. I laughed it off, but the sound came out thinner than I meant it to. The stop felt less like a public place and more like a room we were trapped inside together. He offered small favors that seemed thoughtful on the surface, holding his umbrella a little wider when the wind shifted. Pointing out a shortcut he claimed locals used when transit failed. Each gesture carried an expectation of trust, like a series of tiny contracts I hadn't agreed to but was being held to anyway. I noticed how his eyes tracked movement down the street, then returned to me, steady and patient. He never rushed, never raised his voice, never did anything that could be called openly threatening. That restraint made it harder to justify the alarm building in my chest. I told myself I was overreacting, that this was just an awkward conversation stretched too long by bad weather. The moment that broke the illusion came without drama. He repeated my destination back to me, correcting a detail I hadn't realized I'd shared. Then he mentioned how empty my route usually got after dark, as if it were common knowledge. His words landed carefully, spaced out, giving me time to absorb them. I could hear the water dripping from the shelter roof, slow and rhythmic, marking time. I realized he had been charting my answers the way someone studies a map. Not to get somewhere, but to decide when to act. I stepped back, pretending to check my phone, creating distance without making it obvious. When headlights finally appeared in the distance, relief hit so fast it almost hurt. The bus pulled in with a hiss of air and spray of water, bright and loud enough to shatter the quiet he'd built. I moved toward the door without looking at him again, heart pounding but posture steady. As I climbed aboard, I felt his gaze on my back, patient even now. The doors closed, and through the rain-streaked glass he gave a small nod, like a job left unfinished rather than abandoned. I rode home standing, watching every reflection in the window. That night taught me something I still carry. Calm can be a tool, and kindness can be a way to count exits before choosing one. I got off several stops earlier than usual, choosing a brighter stretch of street with open storefronts. Rain followed me in thin sheets, but the noise of traffic and voices helped ground me. Inside a convenience store, I stood by the drinks cooler longer than necessary, pretending to compare labels. My reflection looked normal, which felt strange considering how alert I was. I watched the door, expecting to see him step in, but he never did. When I finally left, I took a route I'd never used before, looping through blocks that smelled like wet concrete and coffee. The walk home took longer, yet every extra minute felt like insurance. I locked my door and listened to the building settle, counting breaths until the tension eased. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it came in fragments. I kept replaying the cadence of his questions, how each one slid neatly into the next. None of it sounded alarming on its own, which bothered me more than anything obvious would have. By morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the streets rinsed and ordinary. I told myself to let it go, to treat it as a close call that ended cleanly. Still, I changed my routine that day, leaving earlier and taking a different stop. Familiar places felt newly exposed, like they'd lost a layer of cover. Later that week, I mentioned the encounter to a coworker during lunch. Saying it out loud stripped away the doubt I'd been carrying. She pointed out details I hadn't emphasized, like how he'd tracked who came and went, and how his help always nudged me toward dependence. I filed a non-emergency report, not expecting anything to come of it, just wanting the record to exist. The officer listened without interrupting, nodding at the right moments. He said the description fit a pattern they'd seen before, which was both validating and unsettling. Walking out of that station, I felt lighter, as if naming it had taken some of its weight away. Nothing like that has happened since, and I hope it never does. I still use public transportation, still stand in the rain when delays stack up, still exchange small talk with strangers. What changed is the way I measure calm. Politeness no longer equals safety, and patience doesn't always mean kindness. I pay attention to how questions line up and what they're trying to collect. That night ended without harm, but it left me sharper, less willing to fill silence for someone else's benefit. If this helps even one person recognize the difference sooner, then writing it here feels worth it.